Baltimore, March 1857. The harbor stank of rot and opportunity in equal measure. Fish guts slicked the docks where merchant ships prepared for their northbound runs. Tar bubbled in iron pots. Men shouted prices for cotton bales stacked like monuments to someone else's labor. And somewhere in that chaos of commerce, hidden among legitimate cargo, was a crime that would either end in freedom or death. Her name was Lear Green. She was 18 years old. For the past 4 years, James Noble had visited her room every night. Noble was a respected merchant. He kept his household slaves well dressed because appearances mattered in Baltimore society. Behind closed doors, he kept them terrified because power mattered more. Lear had been sold 3 times before her 15th birthday. Each sale stripped away another layer of whatever hope looked like for a girl born as property. By the time William Adams found her again, she'd learned that resistance brought punishment, tears brought mockery, and the law considered her no different than the furniture. William Adams was a miracle Lear hadn't dared pray for, a free black man in a city that made freedom almost impossible. He worked the docks as a stevedore. His muscles earned loading ships that connected Maryland to everywhere else. He'd known Lear since childhood, back when they'd both lived on the same plantation before she was sold away, and he somehow, through means he never fully explained, bought his freedom. When he learned what Noble did to her, he began planning murder or salvation. In 1857 Baltimore, they were the same thing. The plan required a seafarer's chest and enough courage to die trying. William's mother Mary obtained one from a sailor who knew better than to ask questions. It measured exactly 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, 2 feet 8 inches deep, large enough to hold a human being curled tight, small enough not to draw attention from customs men who checked cargo with whiskey on their breath and other business on their minds. Mary drilled a gimlet hole near the top, no wider than a nail, disguised with brass fitting that looked like normal hardware. That hole would let in air. Maybe. Enough to keep someone alive for 18 hours. Maybe. They spent weeks mapping the route. Baltimore to Philadelphia by steamboat. Which captains were sympathetic? Which customs officers were lazy? Which days saw heavy traffic and which saw scrutiny? March 18th fell on a Wednesday, midweek when the docks churned with routine chaos, and one more chest meant nothing to nobody. On the morning of March 18th, in a shed 3 blocks from the harbor, Lear Green climbed into her wooden coffin. She wore her simplest dress, nothing with hoops that took up space she couldn't spare. William gave her a water container and a cloth to muffle screams. She carried nothing else. No letters, no possessions, no evidence. If they opened this chest, she'd be dragged back to Noble and sold so far south that escape would become a memory. The lid closed. Darkness swallowed everything. Panic hit immediately. Her heart hammered against ribs that had nowhere to expand. The air tasted already used, already wrong. She wanted to scream, to push the lid open, to choose any death except this slow suffocation in splinters and darkness. But then she thought about Noble's hands, about 4 more years or 40 more years of those hands, about the choice between this wooden box and that nightly violation. She forced herself still. William's hammer sounded like thunder, each nail another seal on either her grave or her future. She couldn't sit up, couldn't straighten her legs, could barely move her arms. Within minutes, her muscles started cramping. Within 10 minutes, the pain became the only thing she could think about except the air, which seemed thinner with every breath, and the darkness, which pressed in like something alive. Through the wood she heard movement, heard William and Mary grunting as they loaded the chest onto a cart. The motion made her stomach lurch. She bit down on the cloth, fighting nausea because there was nowhere to vomit except on herself where she'd lie in it for the next 18 hours. The cart rattled over cobblestones. Each bump shot pain through her cramped spine. She tried counting the jolts to measure distance but lost track somewhere between agony and terror. At the docks, voices. William's voice, steady and calm, discussing shipping rates. Another voice, white, asking questions she couldn't quite hear. A long silence that stretched until she thought her heart would stop just from fear. Then movement again. Being lifted, carried, dropped with a thud that knocked the air from her lungs. More voices, different ones. footsteps echoing on wood. The quality of sound changed. She was on the ship now, surrounded by hull and cargo and other people's property. Other cargo got stacked around her, on top of her, pressing down until she felt buried alive. That's when the true horror started. The darkness was absolute. The position was agony. The air was dying. But the worst part was time, which stopped meaning anything. Was it minutes or hours? Had the ship even left port? Was she going to die here, undiscovered, rotting in a chest labeled personal effects, until someone finally opened it weeks from now and found what was left? The ship began moving. The rocking helped, gave her some sense of place, some connection to the world outside this wooden hell. But it also made her more aware of how tiny this space was, how completely trapped she was, how dependent on William's plan working perfectly. Above her, sailors walked and worked and laughed. None knew she existed. None knew that just feet below them, a woman was suffocating one breath at a time. She thought about dying, almost welcomed it. Anything to end this. But she also thought about Philadelphia streets where she could walk as a person instead of property. About William waiting for her. About choosing her own life. So she kept breathing. Small breaths. Shallow. Counting each one like currency. Hours bled into more hours. Her legs went numb. Then her arms. Her back felt like it was breaking, vertebrae grinding in a position the human spine was never meant to hold. She couldn't feel her hands anymore. Couldn't tell if she was still moving her fingers or if they'd died along with everything else. The temperature shifted. Cold in the cargo hold. Then hot when the sun hit the deck above. Then cold again as evening came. Each change brought fresh suffering. Cold made her shiver, but she couldn't move enough to generate warmth. Heat made her sweat, but the moisture had nowhere to go in this sealed box. Sometime in the darkness, she didn't know when because time had stopped existing, Lear Green stopped fighting, not gave up, but accepted. She accepted that she might die in this chest, accepted that she'd made a choice and would live or die by it, accepted that this moment, this suffering, was her answer to James Noble. She'd rather die trying to escape than live one more day as his property. That acceptance brought strange peace, a calm that settled even as her body screamed. She was already free, in a way. Noble couldn't touch her here, couldn't reach her. Whether she arrived in Philadelphia alive or dead, she'd never be his slave again. The ship moved through the night carrying cotton and tobacco and rum, and one woman betting her life on a gimlet hole in hope. Lear breathed, small, shallow breaths that barely moved her chest. She counted them like victories. One more breath, one more minute, one more mile toward freedom or death. William Adams stood on the deck of the steamship Keystone State and watched Baltimore disappear into morning fog. Below his feet, in the cargo hold stacked with cotton bales and tobacco barrels and crates marked personal effects, Lear Green was either alive or dead. He wouldn't know which until Philadelphia. Couldn't check. Couldn't ask. Couldn't do anything except stand there like a regular passenger and pray to a God who'd watched millions of enslaved people die without intervention. His mother, Mary, stood beside him, her hands gripping the rail so hard her knuckles had gone pale. She hadn't spoken since they'd boarded. Neither of them had. What was there to say? They'd just sealed an 18-year-old woman into a wooden box barely larger than a coffin and shipped her as cargo. They'd either saved her life or killed her in the most terrifying way imaginable. "She's strong," Mary whispered finally, not looking at William, looking at the water churning past the hull. "She'll survive." William didn't answer, because strength had nothing to do with it. You couldn't be strong enough to breathe when the air ran out. Couldn't be strong enough to survive if the ship's cargo shifted and crushed the chest. Couldn't be strong enough to stay silent if the panic took over completely and you started screaming for someone to let you out. The route they were traveling had a name among those who knew to listen for it: the Blue Highway, a maritime network of escape that moved enslaved people by sea instead of land, by water instead of the Underground Railroad's safe houses and hidden routes. It was faster than traveling overland, more dangerous, and far less documented. The ships leaving southern ports carried thousands of tons of cargo daily. Customs officials couldn't check everything, didn't want to check everything. A chest or barrel could contain anything: personal belongings, commercial goods, contraband liquor, or a human being gambling their life on a gimlet hole and hope. The inspections were cursory at best, especially when you looked the part of legitimate passengers and paid your fares without fuss. But the risks were extraordinary. Stowaways discovered at sea were sometimes thrown overboard. The captains couldn't afford to be associated with slave trafficking, and a body in the ocean left no evidence. Those found in port were returned to their masters under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required northern states to assist in recapturing runaways. Federal marshals worked alongside slave catchers in cities like Philadelphia and New York, operating openly, offering rewards for information, conducting raids with legal protection. And the penalties for those who helped? Massive fines, 6 months in prison, social ostracism, death threats from Southern sympathizers who operated in northern cities with impunity. William had heard stories of abolitionists beaten to death in Philadelphia streets, of black freedmen kidnapped and sold south despite their papers proving their status, of families destroyed for the crime of wanting to be free. He'd accepted those risks when he started planning Lear's escape. His mother had accepted them when she bought the chest, and Lear had accepted them when she climbed inside. The Keystone State was a side-wheel steamship that made the Baltimore-Philadelphia run 3 times weekly. It was faster than the older sailing vessels, cutting the journey from 24 hours down to 18. That speed mattered when someone was sealed in a chest fighting for every breath. Every hour saved was another hour Lear might survive. William had chosen this ship carefully. The captain, a man named Eldridge, was known to be sympathetic to the abolitionist cause. Not actively involved, he couldn't afford to be, but sympathetic enough to not look too closely at certain cargo. William had paid extra to ensure the chest was placed in a specific section of the hold, away from the heaviest loads, where the risk of crushing was lower. But even with careful planning, 1,000 things could go wrong. The ship could take on water. The hold could flood. The chest could be moved during the voyage, stacked differently, buried under cargo that cut off the gimlet hole's access to air. A nosy customs official in Philadelphia could decide to inspect random containers. Another passenger could report suspicious behavior, or Lear could simply run out of air. William had calculated it obsessively: the chest's interior volume, the approximate amount of breathable air it contained, Lear's likely respiration rate under stress, the gimlet hole's diameter, and the rate of air exchange it might provide. The mathematics suggested she could survive 18 hours. Maybe, if everything went perfectly, if she didn't panic and hyperventilate, if the hole didn't get blocked, if. Below deck, in the darkness Lear couldn't see through, time had stopped meaning anything. She'd lost count of her breaths, lost track of whether her eyes were open or closed because the blackness was the same either way, lost feeling in most of her body, which had gone numb from being locked in the same cramped position for what felt like years. The panic came in waves now instead of constantly. Moments of absolute terror where she thought her lungs would burst, where she wanted to scream and claw at the lid and make it stop at any cost. Then moments of strange calm where she drifted somewhere between consciousness and whatever came after, her mind protecting itself by shutting down piece by piece. She thought about her mother, who she hadn't seen since age 12, wondered if she was still alive, wondered if she'd ever know what happened to her daughter, whether Lear made it to freedom or died trying or got caught and sold even farther south as punishment. She thought about the other women who'd endured what she'd endured, the endless others across the South who were right now experiencing what she'd experienced every night for 4 years in James Noble's house, the ones who would never escape, who would die enslaved, their bodies used until they broke, their children born into the same bondage. She thought about William waiting above, about the life they might build if she survived this, about choosing her own work, her own home, her own body's uses, about the simple miracle of saying no and having it mean something. The ship hit rough water somewhere in the Chesapeake Bay. The motion changed from gentle rocking to violent pitching. Cargo shifted in the hold. Lear heard crashes, felt her chest slide across the deck, slam into something solid. The impact rattled her teeth, made her bite her tongue, filled her mouth with blood she had to swallow because there was nowhere to spit. More impacts. The chest being thrown around like dice in a cup as the storm intensified. Each crash brought new pain, new terror that the wood would split, that the lid would break open and expose her, that the whole thing would come apart and leave her visible and captured, or that it would break apart and she'd drown in the flooding hold with freedom so close. The storm lasted an eternity, then stopped as suddenly as it started. The motion returned to gentle swaying. Lear lay in her wooden prison trying to determine if anything was broken. Her ribs hurt. Her head throbbed where it had slammed against the chest's interior. But she was alive, still breathing, still counting breaths like currency. On deck, William had watched the storm batter the ship and thought about the cargo hold, about Lear being thrown around down there, and forced himself to stay perfectly still. Regular passengers didn't worry about specific pieces of cargo. Regular passengers didn't stare at the hold entrance like they could see through wood and darkness. He made himself look at the horizon instead, made himself appear calm, made himself invisible. Mary prayed beside him, lips moving silently, hands clasped. William didn't pray. Couldn't. Because if God existed, he'd been watching slavery flourish for 2 centuries without meaningful intervention. Prayer felt like asking permission from someone who'd already made their position clear. The coast of Delaware appeared in the afternoon light. They were making good time. Another few hours and they'd reach Philadelphia. Another few hours and they'd know if Lear had survived or if they'd killed her with kindness. William thought about what came after, assuming she lived. The Vigilance Committee would receive her, provide temporary shelter, medical care if needed. Then they'd move her farther north. Elmira, probably. Far enough from the border that slave catchers operated less openly. He'd follow. They'd marry. Build something resembling a normal life. But first she had to survive the next 3 hours. In the chest, Lear's consciousness had narrowed to a single point of focus. Breathing. That's all that mattered. In, out, in, out. The air tasted wrong now, used up, poisonous. Each breath took conscious effort, forcing her lungs to work against atmosphere that didn't want to support life anymore. She couldn't feel her body, couldn't tell if her limbs still existed, or if she'd become just a mind floating in darkness, experiencing death by degrees. The line between alive and dead had blurred into something indefinable. Maybe she was already dead and just didn't know it yet. The ship's whistle blew. 2 long blasts. The sound penetrated the chest, loud enough to hurt. They were arriving. Had to be. Ships didn't blow their whistles like that except when approaching port. Lear tried to prepare herself for what came next, for the chest being moved, unloaded, opened, for seeing light again after 18 hours of absolute darkness, for moving limbs that had been locked in place so long she wasn't sure they'd still work, for freedom if she'd earned it, for death if that's what the gimlet hole had decided. The ship docked. Lear heard the change in engine noise, felt the bump as hull met pier, heard voices shouting, ropes being thrown, cargo being cataloged, heard footsteps approaching the hold, heard someone say, "Check that one," and footsteps coming closer. Either way, she was done being property. The customs official's boots stopped 3 feet from the chest. Lear heard them clearly through the wood, heavy leather on planking, each step announcing authority and consequence. She forced herself absolutely still, though stillness had become her only possible state after 18 hours locked in this position. Her lungs screamed for air she couldn't give them. Her heart hammered so loud she thought it would give her away. "This one," the voice said again. Male. Bored. Just doing his job, which today meant the difference between Lear's freedom and her death. She heard hands on the lid, felt the chest shift as someone grabbed it. Then William's voice, casual, irritated in the perfect way of a man whose time was being wasted. "That's mine. Personal effects. Got the receipt right here if you need it." Paper rustling. A pause that stretched into forever. "Fine. Move along." The footsteps walked away. Lear didn't breathe, couldn't breathe, waited until silence replaced authority before letting herself believe she'd survived inspection. But survived for what? She still couldn't move, still couldn't call out, was still sealed in darkness with air that had stopped being breathable hours ago. The chest stayed where it was for what felt like days but was probably minutes. Then hands again, lifting, carrying. Different motion now. Off the ship. Onto solid ground. Philadelphia. Free soil. But Lear wasn't free yet. She was dying by degrees in a wooden box on free soil, which was still dying. The journey continued, bouncing in a wagon over cobblestones that sent fresh pain through her cramped body. Stopping, being lifted again, carried into a building, placed on a floor, then voices, urgent ones, and hands working at the lid. Quickly. We don't know how long she's been without air. The nails came out. Light flooded in, blinding after 18 hours of absolute darkness. Lear couldn't see anything except white brightness that hurt worse than the darkness had. Couldn't move even when hands reached in to help her. Her body had locked into position, muscles frozen, joints seized. They lifted her out anyway, gentle hands belonging to faces she couldn't see yet, laid her on something soft, a bed, the first soft thing she'd touched in 18 hours. She's alive, someone said, like it was a surprise worth noting. Lear tried to speak, but nothing came out. Tried to move, but her limbs had forgotten how. The room gradually came into focus. 3 faces looking down at her. Strangers. Abolitionists. The Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. Can you hear me? A woman's voice kneeling beside her. You're safe now. You're in Philadelphia. Safe. The word didn't connect to anything real. Get her water, one of the men said, and send for William. Water came. Lear couldn't hold the cup, couldn't coordinate her hands. The woman helped, tipping small sips into her mouth. The water tasted like possibility, like everything she'd gambled for, but her throat had forgotten how to work properly. William appeared in the doorway, and Lear started crying then. Silent tears because she still couldn't make sounds. He knelt beside the bed and took her hand. You did it, he whispered. You're free. The paralysis lasted 3 days. Doctors came, examined her limbs, tested reflexes, declared the damage might be permanent or might resolve with time. No one knew. No one had experience with people who'd spent 18 hours in a chest. Sensation returned gradually. First pain, constant and sharp. Then pins and needles as blood flow resumed. Then finally movement. Fingers first, then hands. Her legs took longer. By the 4th day she could sit up. By the 5th she could stand with help. By the 6th she could walk a few steps before pain forced her back to bed. The Vigilance Committee kept her hidden in a safe house where other runaways stayed temporarily. William visited daily, bringing news. Noble had posted advertisements. $200 reward. The notices described her in painful detail and had been distributed to every port city from Baltimore to Boston. We need to move you, William said on the 7th day. Elmira, New York. Far enough north that slave catchers operate less openly. When? Tomorrow night. The Fugitive Slave Act meant even free soil wasn't truly free. Federal marshals operated in Philadelphia. Slave catchers hunted runaways with legal protection. Lear would need forged papers, a new identity, constant vigilance. The next evening, dressed as a domestic servant to a wealthy family, Lear left Philadelphia. The journey north took 3 days. At every stop she expected arrest, exposure, chains. But the disguise held. The papers worked. Elmira was smaller, quieter, a town where the Underground Railroad had deep roots. William had made arrangements. There was a small house, 2 rooms. There was work available, domestic service that paid wages. On April 2nd, 1857, 2 weeks after her escape, Lear Green married William Adams in a ceremony that would have been illegal in Maryland. She learned to read, made friends in the small community of formerly enslaved people, chose her own clothes, her own schedule, her own life. She was free in ways she'd only imagined, but freedom couldn't erase what had been done. The nightmares came almost nightly, dreams of being locked in darkness, of air running out, of hands she couldn't escape. She'd wake screaming, William holding her, both of them knowing safe was relative. The physical symptoms started mild: a cough, difficulty breathing in enclosed spaces, panic when rooms felt too small or too dark. The doctors couldn't explain it, couldn't treat it. By 1859, the cough had worsened. She tired easily, spent more days in bed than out of it. William hired every doctor he could afford. None could help. The illness progressed slowly, steadily. Not consumption, though that's what they called it. Something deeper, something that happened when trauma lived in the body permanently, when 18 hours of suffocating darkness left wounds no medicine could heal. By early 1860, she was bedridden more often than not. The cough produced blood. Breathing became harder each day, like drowning on dry land, like being sealed in that chest again and again and never escaping. On their first anniversary, April 2nd, 1860, Lear woke William in the middle of the night. "I can't breathe," she whispered. Blood on her lips caught the lamplight like rubies. William Adams sat beside his wife's bed and watched her drown on dry land. Each breath came as a struggle, her lungs fighting to extract oxygen from air that should have sustained her but somehow didn't. The sound was terrible, a wet, rattling wheeze that reminded him of that chest, of 18 hours sealed in darkness, of air that ran out degree by degree until survival meant choosing between suffocation now or later. The doctor had left an hour ago. There was nothing more he could do. No medicine for whatever was killing Lear from the inside out. No treatment for damage that lived in the body like a permanent resident, taking up space where breath should go. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible through the blood on her lips. "For what?" "For not being stronger." William took her hand, the one that had lost feeling in that chest and never fully recovered, the fingers that stayed slightly curled no matter how much she tried to straighten them. "You're the strongest person I've ever known." She smiled, but it was the smile of someone who knew the truth. She'd escaped James Noble. She'd survived 18 hours that should have killed her. She'd built 3 years of freedom from nothing but courage and a gimlet hole. But she hadn't been strong enough to outrun what that chest had done to her. Trauma didn't care about strength. It just waited, patient, for the body to give up fighting. "Tell me about the ocean," she said, changing the subject the way she always did when death became too present. "The one we'll see when I'm better." They both knew she wasn't getting better, but William played along, the way he had for months now. "It's bigger than anything you can imagine, goes on forever in every direction. Blue? So blue it hurts to look at. And we'll have a house near it? Right on the shore. You can hear the waves at night." Lear closed her eyes, imagining a future they'd never have. A house by an ocean she'd never see. A life that lasted longer than 3 years, 3 months, and 1 day. She died on June 3rd, 1860, just after dawn. William was holding her hand. Her last words were, "I can't breathe," which were also the words she'd said 18 hours into that journey, the words that had defined the last 3 years, the words that slavery had taught her and freedom couldn't unteach. She was 21 years old. She'd been free for 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. She'd been enslaved for 17 years, 9 months, and 17 days. The math was brutal in its clarity. Freedom had barely outlasted adolescence. William buried her in Elmira's cemetery, in the section reserved for black residents, which was separate from the white section because freedom in 1860. America meant different things depending on skin color. He couldn't put her real name on the headstone. Too dangerous. Noble's advertisement still circulated. The Fugitive Slave Act still had teeth. So the marker read simply, L. Adams, beloved wife, 1839-1860. No mention of what she'd escaped, no mention of what it had cost, just initials and dates that told nothing of the story between them. The grave remained unmarked in any meaningful way. No one came to visit except William. No one knew who L. Adams was or why she'd died so young. She became another black woman buried in an unmarked grave in a northern town, one of thousands whose stories disappeared with them, whose lives were footnotes to larger histories that rarely bothered to record individual suffering. William kept working on the docks, kept living in the two-room house that still smelled like Lear's soap, kept the chest in a corner, covered with a blanket, unable to destroy it, but unable to look at it. The chest had saved her life and killed her slowly. It deserved preservation and destruction in equal measure. In 1872, a man named William Still published a book called The Underground Railroad. Still had been chairman of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, the one who'd received Lear when they opened that chest in 1857. His book documented hundreds of escapes, thousands of people who'd risked everything for freedom. Lear's story got one paragraph. Still wrote, "In March 1857, a young woman arrived from Baltimore in a sailor's chest, having endured 18 hours of confinement. She was received in a state of extreme distress but survived the journey. She subsequently married and settled in New York State." That was it. 7 lines to summarize 18 hours of terror, 3 years of freedom, and a death at 21 from wounds invisible to doctors but real as any bullet. The chest itself was donated to the Vigilance Committee's collection. Still kept it, along with dozens of other artifacts from the Underground Railroad era. Hidden compartments and furniture, false bottom trunks, disguises and forged papers and maps showing safe houses. Physical evidence of the elaborate networks that moved enslaved people to freedom one desperate gamble at a time. Over the decades, as the Vigilance Committee's records were preserved and displayed, Lear's chest became one of the centerpiece artifacts. It was displayed at exhibitions about the Underground Railroad, written about in historical accounts, photographed for textbooks, but Lear herself remained invisible. The woman who'd spent 18 hours in that chest became secondary to the chest itself. Visitors marveled at the small size, at the gimlet hole, at the impossibility of human survival in such confinement. They rarely asked about the woman who'd done the surviving, rarely wondered what happened to her after Philadelphia, rarely questioned why the official record gave her one paragraph and moved on. William Adams lived until 1903, 43 years after Lear's death. He never remarried, never had children, never spoke publicly about what they'd done, though occasionally in his final years he told the story to young people in Elmira's black community, told them about the girl who'd chosen a wooden coffin over slavery, told them about 18 hours that bought 3 years of freedom, told them about love that survived trauma but couldn't save the person who'd endured it. He died in the same house where Lear had died, in the same room where she'd spent her last months coughing blood and dreaming of oceans she'd never see. He was buried next to her in the black section of the cemetery. His headstone read, "William Adams, 1823-1903, devoted husband." No mention of what he'd devoted himself to. No mention of the chest or the rescue or the woman who'd died too young. Their graves remain today, both marked only with initials and dates, both telling nothing to casual visitors who wouldn't know to ask. The story died with William because he'd protected Lear's anonymity even in death, unwilling to expose her to the historical record when that record was written by and for people who'd considered her property. The chest survived because objects last longer than people and attract more attention than individual suffering. It sits now in a museum in Philadelphia, part of a permanent exhibition about the Underground Railroad and the Blue Highway maritime escape route. The placard beside it tells Lear's story in condensed form. 3 sentences about the escape. 1 sentence about her marriage. 1 sentence noting she died in 1860. Nothing about James Noble and what he did to her. Nothing about 4 years of nightly violations that made a wooden coffin seem preferable to survival. Nothing about the nightmares that followed her into freedom. Nothing about dying at 21 because some wounds don't heal. They just kill slowly enough that cause of death gets listed as consumption. The chest is smaller than visitors expect. 3 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet 8 inches. Adults who see it often try to imagine curling into that space and can't. Children who see it ask how anyone breathed. The gimlet hole is pointed out, that tiny opening that was supposed to provide air for 18 hours, and people marvel that it worked at all. But it didn't really work, not in any meaningful sense. Lear survived the journey, but the journey didn't survive her. The chest might have brought her body to Philadelphia intact, but it broke something deeper, something that couldn't be fixed with medicine or time or love. The museum label calls her escape successful. And in the narrow technical sense, it was. She made it from Baltimore to Philadelphia alive. She gained her freedom under law, at least until the Fugitive Slave Act's teeth caught up with her, which they never did because she died first. But was it successful when she died at 21? When freedom lasted 3 years and was haunted by nightmares of the very device that had enabled it? When the price of escape was a slow death that looked like drowning, like suffocating, like being sealed in that chest forever? History measures success by whether people reached free soil and stayed there. By those metrics, Lear Green succeeded. She escaped slavery. She married. She lived free, however briefly. But history doesn't measure the cost, doesn't count the nightmares or the coughing blood or the panic attacks when rooms got too small, doesn't acknowledge that freedom for Lear meant carrying that chest with her everywhere, sealed inside her lungs and her memories, killing her one breath at a time. The maritime escape route she used, the Blue Highway, moved thousands of enslaved people to freedom between 1830 and 1865. Most of their names are lost. Most of their stories survive only as statistics in ledgers kept by vigilance committees and abolitionist organizations. A handful, like Lear, left physical evidence: a chest, a letter, a mention in someone's journal. The vast majority left nothing. They disappeared into freedom or death, those two destinations often being closer than the living wanted to acknowledge. For every person who made it to Philadelphia alive, how many suffocated in chests and barrels? How many were thrown overboard when discovered? How many reached free soil only to die within years from trauma that had no medical name? Those questions have no answers, because the people who could have answered them couldn't read or write, couldn't leave testimonies, couldn't control how they were remembered. Their stories were filtered through abolitionists who documented escapes, but rarely followed up on what happened after. Through historians who counted successful flights but didn't track mortality rates among survivors. Through museum curators who preserved artifacts but struggled to preserve the humanity of the people who'd used them. Lear Green's story survived because William Still wrote it down, because the chest was donated and preserved, because William Adams kept her memory alive among a small community that passed it down through generations. But even surviving, it's incomplete, reduced to paragraphs, summarized in museum placards, known only to people who specifically seek out Underground Railroad history. The chest itself has become more famous than the woman who used it. That's the bitter irony. The object that nearly killed her, that did kill her eventually, outlasted her memory. Students who study the Underground Railroad see pictures of that chest. They read about a woman who escaped in a sailor's trunk. But they don't read her name. Don't learn about James Noble or 4 years of sexual slavery. Don't learn about 3 years of freedom shadowed by trauma. Don't learn about dying at 21 with blood on your lips and "I can't breathe" as your final words. The chest remains, preserved, protected, displayed behind glass where thousands of people see it annually. Lear Green remains forgotten, buried under initials in an unmarked grave, reduced to 1 paragraph in William Still's book and 3 sentences on a museum placard. The question that never gets asked, the one that should close every telling of this story, is simple and impossible to answer. Did she win? She escaped slavery. She chose the chest over James Noble's hands. She survived 18 hours that should have killed her. She married the man she loved. She learned to read. She lived as a person instead of property for 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. Then she died coughing blood at 21, killed by the same device that had saved her, proving that sometimes freedom and death are the same destination reached by different routes, and the only difference is how long the journey takes. The chest sits in its museum case, mute testimony to desperation and courage and the brutal mathematics of survival. Lear Green lies in her unmarked grave, silent testimony to the fact that escaping slavery didn't mean escaping its damages, and freedom in 1857. America meant something different than the word suggests. Both remain: the object and the absence, the artifact and the ghost. Which one tells the truth depends on what questions you're willing to ask and what answers you're prepared to accept.